You've probably already seen the build that is taking Path of Exile 2 by storm. This is the Comet Stormweaver build that is absolutely annihilating all content. Whether you're trying to clear hundreds of enemies or destroy bosses, this build does it all by raining down comets, exploding frost walls to cause huge amounts of shatter damage. A lot of people that are already playing this build are missing out on some key mechanics that prevent them from fully taking advantage of this ridiculous build. The biggest mistake I see people making is not understanding meta gems. So their build does not cast Comet on every freeze, it casts Comet on every second freeze instead, which seriously hinders its potential. So today I'll be explaining to you how we set this up as quickly as possible, following on from my previous Frost Sorceress guides, and what to use in the interim period before you unlock Comet, so the transition into this build is as smooth as possible, and what gems and passives to use so you do cast Comet on every single freeze. Planner link will be down in the comments below. So the core gameplay loop of the build is pretty simple. We use Frost Bomb to apply cold exposure to enemies, which lowers their defenses massively against cold damage. It also explodes after a while, applying freeze buildup and huge damage. We then use Frost Wall, which will create these huge ice crystals, which when destroyed causes huge AoE damage. Hint, if you use it against large enemies which can't be blocked by Frost Wall, like most bosses in PoE 2, it's actually instantly destroyed, causing again huge damage and freeze buildup. So spamming Frost Wall can be an amazing way to DPS bosses, and then we spam Frost Ball on top. Usually one cast is enough for trash enemies until enemies are frozen. Once frozen, we trigger Cast on Freeze, which will have Comet socketed in to trigger that beautiful Comet shower. I've actually got a second Comet gem socketed in so I can actively use it in boss rotations as well. So let me explain how we ensure that Comet is cast on every single freeze, because a lot of you out there haven't got it set up right. Now what Cast on Freeze states is that every time we freeze an enemy with a skill, we gain 100 energy. And when we gain maximum energy, we trigger all socketed skill gems. We combine this with the support gem Spell Echo so that when the Cast on Freeze is activated, we spawn a second Comet. So when we freeze, we should trigger 2 Comets every freeze, right? Wrong. It won't unless we do a couple of other things. A lot of people are assuming maximum energy is 100 because 100 is a nice round number, so every freeze will trigger a Comet. But actually maximum energy is a variable number based on the base cast time of the spell we've socketed. Comet, a lot of people think has a base cast time of 1 second, but if you actually read the skill, at the bottom it says it has an additional 1 second. So the total base cast time of Comet is actually 2 seconds. So the maximum energy required for it to trigger is 2 divided by 0.12 times by 10, which is 166.7 energy. So how do we get that 167 energy requirement? Well, the first thing is that Cast on Freeze gives you free bonus energy based on the level of your gem. So if you pick up the Endless Blizzard node, you'll get more than 100 per cast of freeze, as your Cast on Freeze gem is now level 11. You can then socket in Impetus, which will give you 40% more energy when you freeze. This still isn't enough, and the final thing you need to get to 167 energy is the energy node in the passive tree, which now in total will get you over that 167 energy threshold per freeze. So pick up the Endless Blizzard and 8% energy nodes from the tree. These are mandatory for the build. You should sacrifice some of the other nodes if you're short on passive skill tree points if you're a bit lower level, and then put on Impetus and you will cast 2 Comets on every freeze. Note if you don't have Comet yet because you don't have a level 11 skill gem, then replace Comet with Cold Snap instead, which will do the same thing but instead just cast Cold Snap to shatter enemies. The gems remain the same, but in any place in the guide we have Comet, just replace it with Cold Snap instead. And if you don't have Cast on Freeze yet because you haven't killed the Bog Witch in Act 3, then check out my previous guides on the Frost Sorceress for builds to transition you into this one. So for my Frost Bomb, I'm running Spell Cascade. What this does is it allows us to spawn 3 Frost Bombs at once, which I find to be better in lowering a larger number of enemies' cold defenses, or it's useful if a boss moves. I'm also running Magnified Effect for a larger radius, and Strip Away so a Frost Bomb has a stronger cold exposure effect. Cold exposure is really powerful. A lot of people think that an enemy's resistances can't go below 0% in Path of Exile 2. That's actually only true for penetration. Penetration can only lower the resistance to 0%. So stacking penetration becomes less valuable, especially in the end game. But other methods can lower a monster's resistance values to below 0% up to negative 200%. Cold exposure is one such method, so we want to aim to maximize this stat, and you'll see I try and do that in my passive tree later. For my Frostbolt, I'm running Scatter Shot, so we fire 3 Frostbolts at once, and Glaciation to cause more freeze buildup. This means for trash enemies, often just firing frozen orbs with Frost Bomb is enough to trigger a freeze, so you don't necessarily need to use Frost Wall for them. Cast on Freeze, as we've discussed, has Comet, Spell Echo, and Impetus, which will let you reach the energy threshold to spam Comet on Freeze. For Frost Wall, I'm using Icicle. This is another important mechanic in the build. So your Frost Wall has health, and when it's destroyed, it's shattered, which causes that huge AoE damage. Remember, large enemies like bosses automatically destroy Frost Wall, but for smaller and weaker enemies we want to be able to break Frost Wall easier. Icicle helps significantly with that by lowering Frost Wall's health by 50%. I've also added Considered Casting for more damage. You can place Spell Cascade here instead of having it on Frost Bomb for more Frost Wall spam, which could be the move for bosses, but honestly I didn't want to lose out on that triple Frost Bomb for added clearance. You can see I've actually got a second Comet, one in my Cast on Freeze and one separately here. This is because for bosses you want to be actively using Comet in between Frost Wall and Frost Bomb spam. Actively using Comet is not so great for trash enemies because it has a large cast time, but for bosses it's great. Here I've put Unleash, which lets us summon multiple Comets when we cast it once, Concentrated Effect for more damage, and Arcane Tempo to speed up that slow cast speed, because trust me, it does have a long wind up time. I've also got Hypothermia here as our curse. Remember, curses can lower an enemy's resistances below 0%, so it's really valuable, especially on bosses, to make them susceptible to cold damage. Here I've placed the Heightened Curse support gem, so it's even more potent, and then I have Persistent so it lasts longer, and we don't have to interrupt our damage rotation as much. Moving on to our passive tree, the most important nodes for this build are these two. Endless Blizzard, which increases the damage of our skills by like 50 to 60% per level increase, and it's increasing Cast on Freeze's level so it generates more energy naturally. And the second passive to obtain is this one right here on the right to generate more energy so we can use Cast on Comet every time. So starting from the bottom, I initially got these energy shield nodes for more survivability. I then went up and got these increased cast speed nodes because actively using Comet is slow and we want to speed this up. With my next few points, I will pick up these mana regeneration nodes here because once you're raining down Comet heavily, it does become very mana intensive. Then I went up here and picked up these nodes to improve our damage. You want to come up here and pick up all these exposure nodes, which like I've mentioned are really powerful in lowering a monster's resistances. And then come up here and pick up the all-important Endless Blizzard node. Make sure to pick up Glaciation and Inescapable Cold as well. You then want to come across and get the Shattered Crystal node, which will lower the health of our Frost Wall crystals, making them easier to explode. And then finally come up here to get the Meta Gem node to increase our energy generation. In terms of what other nodes to chase, the few I want to get next are Invocated Efficiency to improve our mana regeneration when we trigger Cast on Freeze Comet, and improve its damage. Ether Flow to improve mana regeneration, we really do need it as the build consumes mana like a lot. Arcane Intensity to scale our damage even more. In terms of our Stormweaver nodes, you want to get Scouring Winds because it makes exposure add in an additional 20% lowered resistance. This is additive to Frostbomb's cold exposure, so it's really powerful. With your second ascendancy points, you want to get the Arcane Surge node here because you want to get the increased mana regeneration for the build. In terms of gear, for your weapon, you want to look for a staff with plus levels to cold spells. That is going to scale your damage like no other. Look out for cold damage, spell damage, and cast speed affixes as well. If you're struggling to craft one, you can use the PoE2 trading website and search for either a staff or a wand and focus with these affixes. Honestly, I found the staff I'm looking for just one Exalted Orb, which by the time you're able to make this build you should have one of. And it's so worth spending it for an item as strong as this one, which can carry you to the end game. Like look at this one here, for one Exalted Orb you can get a staff that will carry you from level 3 all the way to like level 60-70. For armor, I highly recommend getting movement speed on your boots. It really does make the gameplay faster. Then on your armor you want to look for resistances, maximum life, maximum mana, and energy shield affixes. Take advantage of these Artificer's Orbs to socket armor, so you can socket runes to improve your resistances. This will really help you to survive. Remember, if you need any currency, use the trading website, which seems to be much cheaper, or you can use the currency exchange if you're short on time, but the ratios aren't as good. So there you have it, my super easy simplified Comet Sorceress build covered in less than 10 minutes that will take you from Act 3 all the way to maps with ease. If you found what I talked about today useful, remember to slap the like button and subscribe to the channel for more PoE2 builds. I'm Mr. Ronit, and that's it for today. Peace out, guys.